Let's put on our nostalgia goggles. So today, in theme of October, we're going to look into one of the best survival horror games of all time, its relevance in video game history. Yes, that is Resident Evil 2, the original for the PlayStation 1. I welcome you back to Raccoon City. Consider subscribing. I would really appreciate that because making these videos takes a chunk of time. Thank you. Before we can look into how Resident Evil 2 as a sequel has value, let's look into what sequels are in the first place and why during the 90s they had more relevance than they do now. In the 1990s, sequels were the rage. It was not uncommon for sequels to be pushed out over and over for a popular franchise. Looking at Terminator 2, Toy Story 2, that came out like 1999. Terminator 2 came out in 1991. Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, 1991. The 90s, just as a basis of some very popular movies in the time. When you think of sequels, why does Resident Evil 2 pop out so much? What makes it a good sequel? To understand this, we need to understand how a sequel is made and done correctly. For a sequel to be worth the time of the viewer, and not just a cash grab for you muggles out there, the content produced needs to be built off the original. A great sequel should expand upon the story, its characters, or introduce themes based on the first original content that this is being made off of. Resident Evil 2 does this by continuing the story of Raccoon City from the original game, where we learned about Raccoon City but didn't have any chance to explore it, which we do in actual gameplay. We see a few sections in the beginning of the game exploring the sections up to the police station, and we get to firsthand experience the negative influence of Umbrella's corruption through the city and its residents. We see this through Chief Irons and the notes incorporating him, where he is actively bribed through Umbrella to make sure the police of that city aren't able to function as well as they probably could have. In addition to this, we also are introduced to William Birkin, who is a Umbrella employee who makes money making these viruses, where his whole life's work is focused on creating the G virus. Capcom took an idea, a small little nugget of information from the first game, and expanded it into the second one, and ended up making a full, fleshed out, believable world because of this. Another aspect of what makes a sequel so impactful is respecting its original canon, keeping continuity with previous forms of content. Terminator 2 is a great example of this, where you have where Terminator comes back in time, tries to kill a particular person, is protected by a particular person, and that is the premise of the movie. Hero versus villain, time travel, cool. But then Terminator 2, the sequel to that, same exact idea. You're introduced to two characters, one person there to protect the hero, one person there to kill the hero, and we learn as we watch the first third of the movie that we are unsure of who is who. The original robot from the first movie is now the good guy. Spoilers for Terminator 2, by the way. Deal with it. The movie's been out for almost 40 years. I think you'll live. It made this more believable because they got the same actor to play the exact same role, and the twist of how the older model from the first movie is now the hero resonates with us on how a time traveler saves the mom. Go watch the movie, they're both great. Just letting you know. This also helps that they use similar assets in the game as we look at guns, notes, and key items. They also reference other characters from the previous games because in the first game we know they work in a police station, we know they're the police department, we know they're part of STARS, but then being able to go to the police station and actually going into the STARS office where we learn about the team itself gives more roots to the story of what makes Raccoon City the way it is. Along we learn notes about Chris, and part of it's a lie in RE2 remake, but whatever. You can't make a sequel and copy and paste the original idea with a single new item or a puzzle, and this is where Resident Evil 2 shines. For the first half of the game, they emulated the original style of RE1, by making the first half of it roughly a puzzle box mansion. You're in the police station, there's puzzles, there's zombies, there's monsters that are unfamiliar to you, that you've got to open doors to get to the next area. Instead of hunters, they introduce lickers. They introduce a couple new twists which add extra layers to the sequel, initially just taking the first game, adding on to it, keeping all the good stuff, while removing some of the jank and adding on additional content to the original game. Point number one with this is the A and B scenarios. Unlike the original game where you had one scenario, you pick a character, you pick a scenario, Chris or Jill, and then you play through them, and then they kind of connect, but not really, and doesn't make much sense. Where one ending, Rebecca lives, the other ending, Barry Burton lives. You're like, what's going on? But in the A and B scenarios, these allow players to play as one of the two protagonists with their different primary plots and tell a cohesive story on how they are surviving the events of Raccoon City. But to get the full narrative of both Plot A and Plot B, where you see them actually engaging with each other periodically through walkie-talkie messages or even cinematic cutscenes to relate, hey, we bumped into each other randomly while exploring this place. Here's some information that might help you out. A good example of this narrative dual story plot telling is in the basement of the police department. You have an item in a locked room. It's in a storage locker with ammo and weapons, and the item choices are extra inventory slots or a dual slotted machine gun. And in order to get the best ending possible, you have to particularly do one of two choices. Not take any items and leave them for the next playthrough of the game with the other character, or pick one and leave the other one for your partner. Because if you play selfishly and take both, this leaves none of them for the associating other player, thus making their experience much more difficult. That is great narrative to combine two different plots and allow them to combine together to allow a more cohesive story where you have two different protagonists doing potentially the same thing, trying to get out of a crazy situation. By showing players this simple choice, it makes the world and its actions have more weight, have more value, unlike the first game where things felt relatively disconnected. Another aspect of why the sequel expanded on the original and what makes it so good is the change of environments. And in RE2, the original, yes, most of the gameplay happens in the same environments, you go through the same stories, same beats, same locations, but there are location different areas that splice up the gameplay. In both A and B gameplays, it's 80% the same with most of the same enemies, but with a relatively new element. And in the B scenario, you experience this where they added something to surprise the player. And that's Mr. X, one of the most iconic characters in Resident Evil. Well, with Mr. X in the game, players now know that something is going to be hunting them. This is explored more in RE2 Remake, but with this inclusion, you're adding a Terminator style of fear into the game where you know the location you are in is not safe, that something is trying to murder you, something that you cannot stop. Pumping ammo into it just temporarily pauses it. RE2 Remake explored this much better with having his stomping sound effects and his unrelenting Mr. X, where he's unstoppable, he will murder you, he just runs up and punches you because he doesn't care. And his whole job is to make you, the player, hate life. This addition to the game added so much weight to your ability to try to leave this terrible place. It took the original, added something new that players enjoyed. Overall, RE2 Original as a sequel fits a lot of requirements that make something great. You take concepts from the original, things that were good, and continue and build upon those while taking things in the game that were questionable or bad or things that players didn't enjoy, and you remove them. The differences in player in RE1, you had your different scenarios. Yes, those were different, but they didn't really make a full story. In RE2, they fixed that by adding the two stories with things that meshed together, in addition to adding the additional fear of having something that hunted you down. In order to make a successful sequel, like in Terminator 2, you take concepts from the original, improve upon them, and take out the things that just you don't think worked. And in that game, they use more CGI. So maybe overall, just add more CGI to everything. overall, what makes a good sequel and why Resident Evil 2 matters is that it was a breaking point for game developers to take an idea, expand upon it, and truly push the limits on what you could do through storytelling and multi-character gameplay, where up until this point, player 1 and player 2, you didn't have any of this multi-cohesive, multi-playing story. It's why Resident Evil 2 is so important in regards to gaming as a whole, and why Resident Evil 2 Remake kind of dropped the ball when that game had the chance to retell those multi-character stories, but they did so in the beginning, and I'm assuming they ran out of budget, but I don't know. That's why Resident Evil 2 matters.